Brilliant. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to see so many familiar faces and also so many new faces, both on the stage and in the audience. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. My name is Alessandro. I'm the Managing Director of EU40, which is the Network of Young Members of the European Parliament. And tonight we are discussing a topic which I find truly interesting. We will discuss about AI, artificial intelligence, and the EU AI Act. And we are really trying to understand whether the AI Act, which is coming up soon as a piece of legislation, is striking the right balance. What about citizens' fundamental rights? What about the protection of innovation while still protecting the people that will be affected by AI. We have a distinguished series of speakers here that I'm very happy to welcome. Thank you very much for being here. And also let me thank, since the beginning, everyone who participated behind the scenes to this event. It's always events bring a lot of work, and we are happy to be able to go back and start to actually meet again. So at the end of this event, we will have a networking cocktail and we will be able to exchange a few interactions. So let me thank everyone that worked behind the scenes, and especially Microsoft for hosting us in their beautiful locations and for providing us with this opportunity. I would like to give the floor now to my colleague, Eva Maydell, member of the European Parliament. She's also the AI Act Rapporteur for the ITRE committee. Eva, I'm really curious to know about what you think about this AI Act, why is it important that we are here tonight to discuss about this, and I would like to thank you especially for co-hosting this discussion with EU40. We always like to collaborate with you, so thank you very much to you and your team for being part of this. Please.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you to EU40 and Microsoft for putting this discussion today and for going ahead with it, because I think we are at a very interesting point, not the most heated point within the discussions, but a good point to keep us, prepared for what's coming up in autumn. And I can see some familiar faces from yesterday's event that I hosted, my annual series regulation for innovation. They were interrupted during the pandemic, but we came back with this high-level conference, which in the past we have held here with Microsoft. We have had Executive Vice President Vestager joining us as well with the very first edition. But the reason why I'm referring to it is because I would like to maybe open up with a quote that one of our guests yesterday at the conference, Gary Kasparov, used that resonated in me. He said, my concern isn't machines, it's the humans. It's about dictators who will use technology to undermine our way of life, and it should not be taken as a threat, but as an opportunity. And as we are shaping up our regulatory future here in Europe, I think it's very clear that we cannot talk about tech without, entangling this conversation within geopolitics. As we're discussing the AI Act, it is clear we cannot ignore the true power struggle that we have between democracies and autocracies. And as we sit in the upcoming negotiations and we are about to discuss amendments, I hope we can truly be able to keep this bigger picture in mind, because I know within the Brussels bubble and when we are in the building next door, it's just very easy to be just focusing on the amendment itself, but I think the consequences of our work will have global repercussions. And we all know, I think, where this global conversation on AI has been going on for some time. But to borrow an expression that Executive Vice President Vestager used once in our conversations, we are the first to put pen to paper in the EU. So in a way, all eyes are on us. And if we come from the notion that AI is too important not to regulate, I would like to leave you with this second part of my thoughts, which is it is also too important not to regulate well. So the conversation around the AI Act in Brussels seems like it's largely being constructed up until at least this moment of the use of biometric facial recognition. And of course, this is a very important debate that we have held. We will continue holding and discussing in light of the report, and it has serious consequences for fundamental rights. But I like to say that this is 5% of the whole story. The other 95%, when we talk about AI, are the businesses that are actually developing and that are using these technologies. And in my report in the ITRE committee, I wanted to focus on this 95% of the story, a story of how, Europe can rise to the challenge and be competitive to its global rivals. And so this is why I'm very glad that this report just 2 weeks ago was adopted with very big support, 61 votes in favor and 2 against, because this gives us a very strong position to argue before the main committees in defending the principles that we outlined. And I will just very briefly, in 5 brief points, mention where we put a lot of emphasis and strength. We didn't want the Christmas tree out of this report, and I'm very grateful for the cooperation with the other shadow rapporteurs, because we didn't want to, say, let's amend everything and come up with what could be the ideal report. We focus on our exclusive, on our shared competences and the strengths of our committee. And so this is why these 5 main areas where we emphasize, the first one focuses on a very ambitious proposal on sandboxes by adding a whole new annex to that. The second one focusing on strengthening the measures for startups and SMEs. The third one is related to having this sort of more internationally recognized definition and going forward with the OSCE definition. The fourth one is giving very clear guidances on robustness, on accuracy, cybersecurity, and data, that these should be feasible and realistic. And finally, the focus was also on AI systems specifically developed and put into service for the sole purpose of scientific research, should not be in the scope. So I hope by having a clear focus and a strong majority, this gives us a good opportunity to defend this position before IMCO and LIBE, because all we want to ensure is that the AI Act will be somewhat balanced. Ideally, the balance will also favor competitiveness, it will foster talent, it will foster innovation, because, and I'm going to conclude, if we don't want that the rest of the world to follow the Chinese model, which we all know what it is. It's utilizing social scoring, using biometric facial recognition, however they see fit and whenever they see fit. Then I think we better make sure that European companies are ready to work on alternative models, telling a different story, and also developing this better and value-based standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. I think you gave us a lot of food for thoughts already on this specific thing. What I take away is definitely the 95%, this focus on the 95% compared to the 5% that is maybe the most talked, let's say, part of the AI Act. So we'll get to that in a second. But I would like to pass the floor to Werner Stengg, cabinet member of Commissioner Vestager, Vice President Vestager. He is responsible for artificial intelligence and data economy, so he's the right guy at the right table. Let's put it this way. And I would like to challenge you, Werner. Let's get to the core of the topic and start already the conversation. Eva mentioned somewhat balanced. This AI Act has to be somewhat balanced. So I wanted to know how you perceive this balance, because sometimes, you know, as regulators, we see certain things, and then sometimes the business perceives things in a different way. So I wanted to know from you, what are your takeaways from this halfway, let's say, in the discussions on the AI Act?
Yeah, thanks for the easy starting question. Let me still start with what you quoted when you quoted my boss. We're the first ones to put pen to paper. That also means, of course, it's difficult to be the first one. There's this big opportunity in that. Yeah, we're first ones and setting global standards, and let's get on with it. But it also means that nobody has done this before. When I've been here for 26 years, and I also worked on much more traditional sectors. And if you have legislation in place for a long time, and then you adapt it to change, you still know 90% of the stuff, and then you have to take in the 10% of what is new and try to change legislation. Here, literally, when we did a white paper, it was a white paper. I mean, so we did, of course, we had a lot of prehistory of working on what does trustworthy AI mean, and in the OECD and with others and so on. But sort of this, you said too important not to legislate, but also too important to legislate in the wrong way. It was a challenge to say, well, what is the approach? Yeah? And there, of course, you come in with balanced, because it's the normal thing you would say, and that you would want. But when it comes to AI, what balance is very hard to define. I mean, the parliament, it took you 1 year in a way to find out who should actually be in charge. And at the end of the day, there's 7 committees that are somehow involved, which is, all of this is not a criticism of the...
That's not my fault, by the way. I'm always for a speedy procedure in the parliament.
And I didn't even mean it as a criticism or accusation, but rather as a manifestation of the fact that there are so many different things to be looked at, Balance, if there's just 2 things to balance out, may be difficult in a way. But the AI Act and the issues that it raises and tries to address are so manifold that there are so many balances to be struck that if you ask me whether we found the right balance, I say it would be a miracle. Right? We're doing our best. The main balance, of course, from the outset was the innovation versus trust balance. That's a no-brainer, because of course we said we want to get the most out of this technology. This was not anti-AI regulation, right? It was meant to be, okay, we want AI to unfold its potential for industry, for society. You all know the positive use cases of AI, and there are so many of those, right? But still address the risks. So the main balance stays between addressing high-risk use cases, which are simply unacceptable for a democratic society. You brought the example of autocratic societies and how this could be, the technology could be abused. It could also be abused, of course, by private companies for many reasons. So addressing those really unacceptable use cases of AI. But then we also said, well, if that is addressed properly and in a uniform way in Europe, then we have trust, hopefully. We have legal certainty, hopefully, if we get all the definitions right and so on. And we get the single market. And then anybody, I'm looking at companies here as well, anybody that develops AI software or considers using AI software would know what rules to follow and then get on with it. As my boss would always say, then go, go, go. Yeah? So that is the main balance, but there are many balances underneath.
So Werner, I have the easiest job tonight, which is asking the questions. You guys have to answer to those questions, and that's the complication. But I hope you will excuse me. But I think that the balance is really like the key at the end of the day. You talk about high risks, so I think that is something that we should tackle. So let's try to follow this journey and then pass on the innovation part. But on the high risks. Cornelia, great to be here with you. You are hosting us tonight, so thank you very much for being here. You're the Senior Director at Microsoft EU Government Affairs, and you're responsible for tech and competition. Wow, very long title. Now we're gonna look into those high risks. What is your perspective on those high risks? As someone at Microsoft where you not only develop but also enable startups, SMEs, and yourself, you develop this AI. What are those high risks, and how do you think we can make sure to mitigate those risks that Eva and Werner were talking about, without those stopping the innovation of those SMEs and those startups that we were mentioning earlier? Thank you for being with us.
Thanks. So let me also do the same as Werner. First of all, I want to say congratulations to your opinion. I think it's really good that you have focused so much on the specific issues. That was really helpful. On the innovation side, there is I'd say there are a couple of layers on the innovation side, and I come back to that in a second. Just first on the high risk, we have welcomed the approach the Commission has taken. And I do agree, this is a difficult topic. It's fascinating at the same time, but we were all scratching our head in how do you actually regulate this? And I remember we were sitting here when there was this announcement that President von der Leyen would regulate this in 100 days, and we were like, oh my God, let's better prepare something. How would this actually look like? And we wouldn't even know how to start. So I think this reflection was really necessary. The focus then really to start regulating what we know is risky, I think is a good starting point. And so I think there's an innovative approach in how to advance this over time. We come from a perspective that is, I think, fairly unique. We have, over the last 5 years, developed ourselves a responsible AI governance model. And I just wanted to at least let everybody know who hasn't seen it. We have last week released publicly for the first time our standard. So the standard is what we require our engineering groups to follow through. That's part of a broader AI governance model, and within this overall governance model where we have specific teams that do specific issues, and I don't want to go in all the details, which would take like 2 hours or so, but one is important. We do have developed over these years now a review exercise where both engineering groups that start developing AI, but also sales organizations that are in conversations with our customers can escalate what we call sensitive uses. And these sensitive uses are broadly categorized in 3 different areas. These are risks to fundamental rights, well, human rights, risks to physical or psychological harm, and risks of serious effects and impacts on people's lives. And when you compare these scenarios, they match pretty much Annex 2 and Annex 3 in certain versions. So we describe it in our own voluntary standard slightly different, but really that is where we think the Commission has started from the right approach on that. So now let me also say a word on the innovation cycle. I think there's 3 parts of innovation. We talk mostly about the innovation on the AI development itself. There is also a lot of innovation happening on responsible AI. And that is the work that is currently done in operationalizing these principles. And what does it mean, fairness? What does it mean, being transparent? What are the practices to advance this through best practices like building transparency notes for customers, or in fact, as a tech company, what we really do is we build tools to advance these principles, such as transparency tools that customers can use, where they can look at errors, or they can look at what how to adapt fairness in specific systems. That is where innovation happens enormously, and this is where we have, for example, focused a lot on the requirements and what needs to be improved in the requirements 8 to 16 in order to allow this innovation to happen. And the third innovation that I think is also not often discussed is the innovation on the user side, and this goes to our second main point, which is the allocation of responsibilities. In order to allow users to innovate properly, they need to be able to think about the intended users as they think about them. It's not only what we thought about it in the first place. So this goes a little bit to the way the overall regulation is structured, because frankly, when you develop these AI systems, in particular AI models or AI systems that are of general purpose, then we will not know all the potential uses that the user can think of, and the innovation happens there too. So.
No, indeed, I hear you and I understand what you're saying, and we will get to the level of responsibility in a second, because I think that is also a big part of what we will need to discuss. Certain parts of the world are reacting to responsibility in different ways, so it would be good to understand what the European Union is all about here. Before we get to that point, please let me welcome Angel Martin. Very happy that you're here with us tonight as well. He's the Senior Director for Digital Health at Johnson & Johnson. Angel, you're also the Chair of the MedTech Europe's Digital Health Committee. So you know quite some of how this AI can be used. You know, we talked about the risks, we talked about the challenges. Of course, AI brings some questions with it, but it's also a tool at the end of the day. And yesterday at Eva's event, I've really heard this as the main message. It's a tool and then can be used in different ways, and we need to make sure that it can be used in the proper ways. But it is a tool at the end of the day. So I would like to ask you, Angel, to tell us what is, according to you, the state of the art on AI? How do you use it at Johnson & Johnson? How do you empower those SMEs and those startups that Eva is referring to when she says we need to find a balance in there?
So I think I hear myself too loud. I think right now, and this is probably also the acknowledgement, and also maybe also relates to the question about striking the right balance, that we see more and more, or we would say vertical industries, using AI and data science across basically the entire business cycle. So from R&D to supply chain to commercial uses. And those applications, some of them have this kind of consumer and citizen facing or interaction, which are really important and should be covered certainly by the AI Act. And in J&J, for instance, I mean, where we see great promise in the use of AI is anything that, for example, help us to understand better how to design, for example, clinical trials. Where are the right patients to understand the disease, and actually whether the treatment will work with those patients, right? We could even, obviously, with AI, using a virtual or let's say, digital twins of people that actually will allow us actually to test, to experiment without actually going with control or with additional population, so we can be more targeted, more efficient in clinical research. We can also use AI, we're using and developing AI in optimizing what happens in the operating room. So how the surgeon can understand better the images that he sees or she sees, how actually that can be interpreted for a better decision, how we can plan actually that much more in advance, and I can track and correlate to the life condition of that patient. And actually it's improving something that sometimes is not so well known or well said, which is the reduction of the variability of outcomes. Sometimes we can actually, unfortunately, with even the same surgeon, have a different outcome than another patient who had the same conditions. And there are many human factors applying there, but sometimes it's also insights which are maybe needed at the time of the decision making or of the operation. So right now, AI could certainly help in that respect, but also comes with limitations. So we should also be clear that AI is not a panacea at all in healthcare. I would say still in the infancy. We still need much more, and we will talk later maybe about what are the kind of enablers. It's also, I mean, Johnson & Johnson, as you know, I mean, we are in the pharmaceutical business, we are in the medical technologies business, but we're also in the consumer health business. And something which also is very promising about the use of artificial intelligence is how we can really personalize the customer experience. So if I'm using any of our skincare products, how do I know that that's really the right product for me? And AI can certainly help actually to provide a more customized and personalized service and products for every individual. So the huge potential, huge needs, and something which is interesting on what has been said before is the European Union is the first to put really a piece of legislation which is that comprehensive on AI. I mean, there are other regions now evolving, maybe more at sector level, not so horizontal, but there are things happening around the world. But certainly the European Union is the first to have such a comprehensive framework. And for us, one reflection is AI does not happen only within the boundaries of the European Union, it's happening across the board. And particularly, for example, in pharmaceutical research, you typically don't have actually the data you need only in the European Union. And sometimes you need to collaborate across borders. COVID-19 was a clear example. So how do we make sure that actually in order to enable innovation to address unmet needs or really important challenges for society, how do we ensure that we can collaborate, right? And I know TTC is looking at that, but certainly we need to start thinking a bit more broadly and more globally when we think about AI policy and AI regulation. The other aspect, which relates also to maybe more in the sector where I am, it's how do we actually strike the balance between what is a good horizontal piece of legislation, because we live in an ecosystem, by the way. AI does not happen always within healthcare. It comes from Microsoft and maybe comes to J&J, and then we see how we can use that technology in healthcare. So it's really important that we have that horizontal piece of legislation that give us a good reference, so our data scientists have a reference. But at the same time, how do we acknowledge the existing legislation, right? So we have the medical devices regulation, which is very comprehensive and addresses a number of elements. How we make sure that the two can live together, right? And that we avoid duplication, we avoid confusion, because in the end, that's the final challenge I would like maybe to highlight is trust also relies not only about what are we expecting, but also how we meet those expectations. And if there is confusion, then people will not really know whether we are really rightly meeting those expectations or not. So for me, that's a critical part to bring innovation forward.
Okay, super. Thank you very much for this overview. Now we broke the ice. We have a microphone that will circulate, so you can actually ask questions. Please keep them very, very concise if you have questions, because we are a bit tight with time. But I think we really would like to involve you guys to be part of the conversation. Werner, I start with you, and then I will pick up a question from the audience if anyone has it. Again, very tough question, but they all come to you tonight. Of course, if anyone else wants to take it and save him at some point,
you can have
He
it.
doesn't need saving.
Please raise your hand. No, Werner, I think it would be interesting. We talked about the challenges, we talked about the risks, and Angel recently mentioned, the rollout might be complicated to some extent, because companies will have, especially small SMEs and startups, will have to adapt to this. So the natural questions that comes to my mind is, of course, you were not responsible for the GDPR part, let's put it this way, but I wonder if the rollout of the AI Act and the regulations that will be in the AI Act will be so hard to be uptaken by the actual users, the citizens, the companies that live in Europe. Have you thought about this at the cabinet of the Commission?
Well, the Commission has certainly thought about this, although I don't think that citizens would have to comply with the AI Act. But first of all, the different stages in this whole process. Yeah, the first is really to see who should be covered by these requirements in the first place. Yeah, and that of course is the issue of what is AI, how do you define it, so what is the technology, what are the high-risk use cases, then would there be some derogations for smaller business, and so on and so forth. So am I in scope of this, yes or no? The second question is, and that needs to be of course clear and proportionate and what have you. The second stage is, well, if I'm in scope, what do I actually have to do? These are then the requirements themselves. Yeah, they also need and this links to the question that you asked, of course. Yeah, because it starts from the top to be sure that it's implementable at the end. Yeah, because the middle part is, of course, what am I supposed to do? What are the requirements? What does data quality actually mean? How do I ensure data quality? What does robustness mean? What does documentation mean? What does all of those things mean actually? How can I implement that in real life? And then comes the implementation phase, and then comes the enforcement phase, which is also, by the way, a big challenge. Yeah? So let's now assume all business out there would be perfectly able to comply with whatever needs to be complied with. And then there's a complaint that goes to public authorities that have enforcement powers. And then they may be scratching their heads and say, oh my God, now how to actually exercise my enforcement powers? I have no idea what they're talking about. Yeah? So you have to think, and we did think about this whole ecosystem. But I mean, what you said was also extremely important, Cornelia, when you said you're working on tools, because that will be the key part, of course. And that's also what we're discussing with the Americans, by the way, in the TTC. Because we do agree on the principle to have trustworthy AI. We do agree on the principle that it should be risk-based and not, across the board, everything that has AI on it is evil and needs to be, regulated. So, but the question will then be, how do you actually, as a business, a small but also a larger business, how do you actually comply? And this is probably a bit less even in regulatory terms. The regulation just has to make sure that the requirements are not disproportionate or unrealistic or excessive. Yeah, that with the best of will, a company couldn't do it. Or they could do it, but it would be totally over the top because given the nature of the risk, you would be doing too much. Yeah. So first we need to get the regulation right, but then we need to get the tools in place. And that is where industry will also play an important role. And actually, whether it's good practice, whether it is tools to be used, I'm not an SME, what tools are available to me that I can actually comply with the requirements? I think this is not just a regulatory issue, it is also one of bridging the gap between legal requirements and practical tools available.
Can I just say?
Yes, please, Cornelia.
So the tools that we have developed, and I might go back to that later on when I'm actually asked to say something, but just to say those tools that I was referring to, they are open source and available on GitHub for everybody. So.
Super. You actually got yourself out of the woods, so good job.
Maybe something on SMEs and startups as well, because I mentioned it as one of the areas that we try to bring more clarity and hopefully less burden. For me, when we were working on a report, we were guided about think about how startups and SMEs are trying to develop AI or use it for their business purposes, would react to some requirements and obligations set to the AI Act. So we kind of had that in our minds when trying to put some meaningful text. Our worry with the discussions with the internal discussions we had is that if we produce something that sounds too burdensome or it's not clear enough, is that some businesses will just decide not to uptake, and not to be willing to develop AI within their existing business, for example. Or others could decide that they would go somewhere else where maybe there are no rules. Maybe there's more funding, maybe there's a better ecosystem. And so this is by what we were guided. Of course, if you're using a high-risk AI, the rules should apply across the board. But what we need to do is to ensure that those rules are somewhat proportionate, that they're feasible, that they're realistic. And this is what we try to do with our text. This is why we are calling for the SME involvement when it comes to the standardization process, basically to try to offset the balance that larger organizations have in this more international and more robust structured. And we are also calling on the Commission to try and to lower the compliance fees. So these are some of the examples. Perhaps lastly, I think it's going to be a bit tricky how to handle general purpose AI systems because we need to ensure a fair balance of responsibilities. Probably it will be one of the two most trickiest, negotiations and conversations that will have to be coming. But for now, from where I sit, it's too early to tell how this would develop, but it would definitely be a topic that we'll be discussing, not just in the Parliament, but in more of those meetings and panels like today's.
Great, thank you, Eva, very much. Before you leave, I wonder if there is any question related to this part. Okay, I see a few. Please, there is one here in front and one just behind. We take two very quickly. Please be brief so that we can get a response.
Can you hear me?
No, we cannot hear you, but...
Oh, we can hear you, but
Okay, now yes.
Try again.
I have a loud voice, so I think
we can hear you.
Thank you all so much for... I think now it works. Perfect. Or not. Okay. So thank you all so much for the input that you have provided, and thank you for hosting us tonight. I'm Christina Kouremenou from the Haviland EU. We have a question because in this event, the major focus is EU citizens and fundamental rights. We have seen, due to popular culture, there is a mistrust toward AI, about the use of AI, how it is perceived from citizens. So we see mistrust for the citizens. Although actually AI and deep machine learning machines, they can really, really help move forward with clinical trials or with patients' data. A question to our co-legislators. Do you think that the EU is going to take concrete steps to increase AI literacy towards citizens?
Thanks a lot. We take a very quick question also over there, and then I would give the floor to Eva first, and then to Werner, and then we give it to Engel and Cornelia.
Great, hello. I've also a question to the co-legislators. My name is Brett Hecht from BBVA, a Spanish bank. Banks are very regulated, and therefore we have certain concerns about the enforcement. So the question is about enforcement. How do you plan to coordinate the enforcement between the horizontal regulation, the horizontal part, and the verticals, the sectoral verticals to one extent, and how do you, the other potential risk of fragmentation we see is with member states. So fragmentation between sectors and member states.
Thank you for the question, and thank you very much for being brief. I really appreciate it. It's always hard as a moderator to keep things brief. Eva, I would give the floor to you also by mentioning that you will have to leave us shortly. So also a big thank you from our side for being here. Please.
No, it's my pleasure, and I wish I could stay for the rest of the 10 more minutes or so. But anyway, that was a very good question on how citizens perceive AI. I think in everything we do, I think we kind of have in mind that we're doing this for the benefit of citizens, to protect them, to protect their fundamental rights, to make sure businesses have clear guidelines so that they can compete, and so on and so forth. But what I'm worried is, and I'm not sure that's the aspect you necessarily were addressing, but probably part of it at least. My worry is that we live in a very, chaotic societies when it comes to information. There's just so much chaos in terms of the information that citizens receive. And in the past couple of years, we have seen that whether it's 5G, whether it's the Istanbul Convention, whether it's vaccines, whether now it's the war in Ukraine, there is a lot of information disorder that we are witnessing. And so I am worried of the fact that probably AI, just because it just sounds so like 5G type of thing that people don't really understand, could be the next area where, we'll hear more of the bad examples rather than the good examples. There are still a lot of media outlets and different forums and an organization, of course, that present objectively, what this technology brings. But there is so much out there, and it is so loud, and it is, I think, unfortunately, sometimes louder than the voices of the co-legislators about, how worried we should be. So I think when we legislate, we also have a responsibility to explain, but to do it in a way that the message can come across in a very understandable way. We know that citizens are not the ones that sit in front of our websites and read all communications and so on. That's mainly for the people in this room and some others in member states. So I think it will be worth making an effort explaining better what are our expectations, why are we doing this in a reasonable way. But there's another caveat, and as a policymaker, I do go to town hall meetings, I do go to tiny little villages or towns and so on. And I can't talk on that topic with citizens because it's just so far away from them. I try to boil it down into simple examples, but it is something that doesn't affect it can affect their electricity bill in a positive way, but it's so difficult for them to grasp it that they're interested into their daily life and they don't see how this plays, they can't make the connection. So that's why it makes it even harder when you work on these topics to communicate them on the ground. And on enforcement, I mean, one of the reasons why we do this legislation is to make sure there's proper enforcement. But Werner can tell us, I guess, a little bit more what are the thoughts. We're not there yet. We haven't concluded the negotiations, and who knows when we'll conclude them exactly. But if there will be no enforcement and no proper enforcement, and it's also part of our duty to make sure that it's enforceable in the first place, right? And indeed, again, member states, I met with a regional minister for digitalization today from a region in Germany. I think it's very important to see that there's a drive from certain regions on the topic with concrete projects, but that's not the case in every region and in every member state. So the uptake is always at a different pace and a different speed. And it's normal. We would like to see it in a more unified way, but it's just normal. I just wish that the member state level technology will be high up on the list of priorities of national politics. But
thank you very much, Eva, Благодаря, and we see each other soon to discuss about this in the next years. Thanks a lot. So while we let Eva go, Werner, 1 minute, because then I want to pass over to responsibility with Cornelia and business development with Engel. But 1 minute to react on this enforcement side of things.
I would have loved to respond to the citizen part as well, but on the informative...
You have 2 minutes, okay, but
yeah, okay, because this is so important, and you refer to AI literacy. We really have to start with digital literacy if you want, and with digital skills, generally speaking, which is also part of the digital decade. You know, all people in all phases of their lives, not just professionally, also privately, and we all need digital skills, and that is also to better understand actually what's going on in the digital world, not just those that we need on the desk when we work. Second, it's not just AI skills, but the issues that you're raising, they would be addressed, and Eva referred to disinformation. Now, they would be addressed in the Digital Services Act, because it's not all in the AI Act, right? If we have algorithmic amplification of content, or even content moderation, whether or not it uses AI doesn't matter, you know, but it affects our lives, and we have therefore rules there, and transparency there, and all sorts of things there. We have the Code of Practice on Disinformation, we have the proposal on political advertising. So skills and information and empowerment of citizens is important across the board. On AI specifically, I think I would just focus on very briefly on the public sector, because there are many public sectors that in different ways would want to use AI or have tried of doing so, but got it wrong and lost citizen trust in this. You know, whether it was social rights, social security benefits in the Netherlands, whether it's in labor markets in other countries. So it's so important to get citizens on board that they trust the good use of AI. Otherwise, public bodies will shy away from this. And that would be a pity because of all the potential that lies in using AI. On enforcement was one of the main reasons for the AI Act, probably in the first place, because the things that are being considered as high risk are not things that we are now forbidding for the first time. Discrimination was never legal. It was never legal to place an unsafe product on the market. It's just that because of the opacity in a lot of those things, you wouldn't even know something illegal is happening. It's a bit what we're also doing in the Digital Services Act. Yeah? So enforcement should be facilitated through the AI Act of things that are already illegal anyway, because it's not about unethical behavior. It is often about illegal behavior that we're trying to identify or prevent from happening, if you want, right? Second part of your question, of course, we knew we were trying to build on existing structures, whether that was on product safety legislation, where we're also not saying we need a separate framework, but we try to plug into existing certification schemes for products to take into account the AI dimension more than in the past. And we're trying also to plug into sector-specific legislation where it exists. In reality, of course, it will be a challenge to get all the authorities talk to one another, exchange the right information. But the idea was, again, not to have all of a sudden two separate oversight bodies that would do the same thing twice, but to talk to one another.
2.5 minutes, so 30 seconds over time, but I'll pardon you this time.
Not bad.
Thank you, Werner, on this. Engel, I get to you in a second, but first on the illegal behaviors that Werner is talking about, Cornelia. So you mentioned earlier you have published this week the Responsible AI Standard package or leaflet, let's say. What about responsibility then? We're talking about enforcement, we're talking about illegal behaviors. Where do you think the responsibility in AI should lay?
It's in the full-fledged life cycle. So you have to start really at the very beginning. And this is sort of where we started our journey, is making our engineers really think about the impacts on people. And it's not what engineers usually do. They think about a cool project, and you really, this whole responsible AI governance is very much also a mind shift change in how to think about this. So, and one important part of our responsible AI standard in this is, how do you get to them? So we, for example, in the high-level group on AI, for those who still remember where we started in the European Union on the discussion, they did a deep dive on the, they had the principles, and then they had sort of like a can't remember exact, ITRE, sort of a specification in how to implement those principles. And for that, in the first round, they did a deep dive, and we did this with a AI tool that was already on the market. One that is not necessarily considered a high risk, but where we thought is more interesting, sort of to get some feedback, and our engineers were really interested in participating. And then they had this, they looked at the questions and couldn't do anything with them. It's like, does your AI system have an impact on fundamental rights? Yes, no. So
they wouldn't know how to answer. That's the idea.
These open questions don't help engineers.
Okay.
So what we did with our AI standard is, so we have this goal, for example, transparency. We want to be transparency, and then we basically, what we did is scaffolding this principle into outcomes, and that is something engineers understand. So we want to do, to be how do you, for example, let's say fairness, you want to have the same quality of the service for different demographic groups.
Of course.
That's an outcome that engineers understand, and then they can solve the problem we are trying to solve. So you need to be more specific on these things.
And on this, Cornelia, let me try to make a link while we pick up the next question. There was a question.
One behind there.
Yeah, with that.
There is something behind there. So while we'll prepare, while we prepare for that, before I get to your question, Engel, I wanted to ask you to link on this and see whether you believe that this sharing of responsibility or identification of responsibilities, as we were discussing earlier, is something that will foster or will stop the use of AI across businesses. I mean, you as Johnson & Johnson are powering sometimes other realities. Same thing for you, Cornelia, at Microsoft. So I wonder whether people will be afraid of responsibility and therefore will not be able to collaborate. So we answer to that question, and then we go to the gentleman over there.
So I will actually link that question back to the literacy one, because when it comes to healthcare, I mean, you all will acknowledge that actually the people you trust the most is the healthcare professional. And in reality, if the healthcare professional doesn't trust or doesn't understand the AI system, you can imagine that then you can forget about digital literacy. I mean, they will not really trust the system. So there is for us a key component, if you like, which is who holds the trust in healthcare. And it's really important that they understand both the benefits but also the limitations of AI, because AI brings limitations as well. So for us, that's important. And I find that we're still also talking, when we talk about AI and digital transformation in general, we talk mostly about urban areas. There is an area which is also concerning to us, which is rural areas, and areas which are less populated with less resources. For example, here in Belgium, which is well populated and well spread, we got around 4 doctors per 1,000 people in Brussels region. We got about 2 in West Flanders. So you can imagine that the access of these people to the doctor, the time of these doctors for the people, and to really educate them on these things, or even have the time to understand digital, is very limited. And that only actually, in my view, increases the digital divide, which again doesn't help to bring more trust and to really help actually the adoption, because in the end, adoption is about trust. So you're not going to adopt if in the end, really customers or patients eventually will not be trusting the system. So for us, that is a value chain, and now I answer your question. There is a whole value chain there, right? Where it's not only what Microsoft does, or even our data scientists, when they bring to use cases trying to solve a specific problems, is also who is going to use that, the hospital, how they're going to integrate that into the healthcare practice, and then also the patient. I mean, how they're going to be communicated about AI being part of the decision-making on their own lives. So there is a whole value chain, and we need to identify very clearly the roles and responsibilities. I think the AI Act brings some light, not all. Probably the rest of the light needs to be brought by sectorial legislation as well. So, but I think that will be my answer to that question.
And I see Werner nodding, so you hit the market there. Please, the question over there.
Yes, hello. So my name is Kai. I am a student in data science from Berlin. I work in data science and public policy. And my question was a little bit on the last topic, but I think still important and kind of connected to general purpose AI. I think there's been this idea going around whether to regulate the general purpose AI, not just for certain users, but more generally. And my question goes a bit in the direction, what's the motivation behind it? Because I really think for someone who develops natural language processing tools, image detection tools, this would fall under general purpose AI because you can use it for different purposes. This is a massive burden, and it's for young people like me who want to be creative, this would really stifle our motivation to do it. Why would it not be enough if you regulate the specific use cases, the high-risk cases only?
Thank you, Sky. Is there any other question so we take two at a time? No, okay, super. Cornelia, you want to go on this?
Love to go on this. So
Stop.
no, it's a great question, and we were puzzled by this last 180-degree change in the council's position, just as much as you were, precisely because suddenly it basically sets upside down the risk-based approach. So just to go back, the general purpose came in with the Slovenian presidency draft that excluded it entirely, and we thought, okay, that's good. We didn't actually have this idea, and this goes a little bit back to Werner's first point. It's so hard to actually, how do you do this? And we always, from the beginning, we spend a lot of time with our researchers, with our data scientists to look at this. And we were from the start saying, we'll build a position on the draft and submitted our feedback to the Commission, but we were always open to learn from others how they read how they understood the draft. And I will say there is still a little bit of confusion, maybe just in my head, but maybe also in others, around recital 61, where they talk about components. Are we actually a component provider when we develop general purpose AI? That's what we first figured now, and then, or are we the provider? And then we talked to our customers and they said, no, we are the providers. And I said, hold on a minute, no, you are the users. So there's quite a bit of confusion who is actually what in this value chain. In part a little bit because of the language that was used. The user is like, some consumers thought they are the users. So it became a little bit confusing, and I think there is still a little bit of that confusion. So I have actually in the hands a proposal to solve that a little bit, and it goes, and you have to see it in the context. I know you want me to.
No, go ahead. Finish the thought.
You want to see this in the context of allocation. So you can put general purpose definition in there, but you need to be clear that the purpose and how you use it is upon the user as defined in the proposal, and then you have to divide up the allocations of the responsibilities, and the bulk of that, in that case, has to be with the user. That doesn't mean that a provider, you as the developer, that wouldn't need to do certain things when it is used in a high risk. And so that was from the start, I think, where this was in particular channel for Annex 3 for standalone AI systems, because the starting point from the Commission was really based on Annex 2, like the product safety ideas. But there are solutions to that, and I hope we can fix this in discussions.
Maybe Cornelia, you can fix it in front of a glass of wine. We are the last thing standing between networking.
If I can fix it, I can't, and Werner can, but I can only help.
Terrific, thank you, Cornelia. So now we are 5 minutes past the end of our discussion, so we will wrap it up. And I would like to ask each and every one of you to give me a 1-minute conclusion about what we have discussed. It can either be a wish for what this AI Act should become at the end of the day, or you let me know how you would like to conclude this conversation. We talked about risks, we talked about challenges, but I think there are also some opportunities there where we can really be the leader as the European Union when we do regulation. We can be the people that the rest of the world looked at. So, Engel, I would start with you, 1-minute conclusion.
Okay. So I think what I would say is we need 3 things, right? We need data, we need talent, and we need trust. I think for data, the European health data space hopefully is going to help a lot. I think when it comes to talent, we already discussed, we need really a very ambitious program and to look at also as sectors, what are their needs, how we can empower them. And I think on trust, as I said, I think we need a clear, predictable framework which works with what already works in the existing legislation, but at the same time, maybe give us some reference where we don't have. So I think in that respect, the AI Act could also be an important contributor. I think those are my 3 things.
Thank you very much, Engel. Martin, for being with us from Johnson & Johnson, much appreciated for you to accept our invitation. Thank you. Cornelia, let's build on that. 1 minute, what are your wishes for this AI Act and what should we pay attention to?
So I can only agree with what Anke was saying. So building indeed on this, I think the importance is that young innovators like the gentleman at the end don't feel that they have no room here anymore. At the same time, we need to help them also to understand the responsibilities they have when building these tools. And so I think the AI Act is a good start. We have welcomed that in particular, but we need to make these requirements easy to understand and easy to implement for developers, so that they can take their responsibilities. And so reducing this to something that is actually implementable, I think that is the core of our objectives here.
Thank you very much, Cornelia, for being with us and for hosting us here tonight, Senior Director at Microsoft. Thanks a lot. Werner, you have the final word. Tough job. Let's try to end it on a positive note, because I know that sometimes when we talk about regulation, the Commission sees things in a different way than the people that need to implement actually those regulations. So I would like to conclude with you and see what you think about this discussion and about the AI Act, and if eventually at the end of the day you think this is going to be maybe not easy to implement, but at least if we will be able as the European Union to be looked at as the leaders in this regulation.
First of all, I would say if those regulated would always agree with us 100%, we probably got it wrong. But that's just a side remark. The main remark is actually that we should try to stay focused on what the purpose of this act is. Because as long as the negotiations go on and discussions in Parliament and Council and trilogues and so on, issues are piling up, of course, and sometimes also expectations what the regulation can achieve and so on. And then you're starting, sometimes even as Commission, you may start losing a bit sight of what you actually try to achieve. I'm not saying that we should not learn during the process, on the contrary, but I would say, whether it's general purpose, whether it's biometrics, what else may have come and will come on the table, from our point of view, we would try to go back to the basics of what we were trying to achieve. We were trying to have something risk-based, that's something that is legally clear, also something that would not solve all the problems out there, because the AI Act is also not the only piece of legislation that will be applicable. It is there to fix the most extreme risks, if you want. Yeah? It does not mean that if you're not in scope of the AI Act, you can do what you want. Either because you as a business would want to act responsibly because you may think ethically, or because there would be existing legislation out there anyway that would prevent you from doing certain things. And being in the AI Act would just increase the risk of being caught doing so. So not trying to think that if we don't get it into the AI Act, everything will be possible. No. So let's try to make sure that we have something that is legally clear, that addresses real problems, and that can be implemented on the ground. If we have achieved that, I think we have achieved a lot.
Let's keep the focus. Thanks a lot, Werner Stengg, member of the cabinet of the Vice President,
Pleasure.
for being with us tonight. So please join me in an applause to all of them. I think the conversation was very interesting, but then I'm really curious to know what you guys think. From my side, that's all. I would like really to thank everyone who worked behind the scenes. There was a lot of work to bring this kind of events to life, from the teams of the people here on stage to actually who's hosting us, who's dealing with the technicalities, and then the people that will take care of us after now. So I thank all of you, of course, for being here. Thank you very much. And we can go for a glass of wine and discussion. Even water is socially acceptable. Thanks a lot and have a good evening.